4 iconic English gardens. Each is the product of one moment in history, and each gives us a fascinating window into the century in which they were made and the people who created them. Much more than just a history of gardening, these are extraordinary tales of escape, social ambition, heartbreak, downfall and disaster. In unravelling these remarkable stories, we reach back over the centuries to see these 4 great gardens through fresh eyes and gain a greater understanding of their real significance. Looming over the village of Buckingham in the southwest of England is one of the grandest and most dramatic gardens in this country, Stowe. Created in the 18th century at a time when England was emerging as a superpower, it's so vast that it can feel like a small country.
Stowe, for me, has always been a sense of scale. This is Capability Brown's Grecian Valley, and it's remarkable to think that there was 24,000 tonnes of topsoil removed from this valley.
250 acres of majestic parkland envelop an extraordinary succession of neoclassical buildings, avenues, lakes and rivers. Stowe isn't a garden of flowers or shrubs, it's a garden of ideas. Shaped by the political ideals of a man called Richard Temple or Viscount Cobham, it fostered a rebellion that overthrew the first Prime Minister of England.
What I love about Stowe is that it's a garden where politics and gardening are deeply interwoven. This is a canvas on which Cobham painted his political manifesto. So every bit here means something. We've just forgotten how to read it.
But Stowe isn't just a bold political statement. It's the garden where nature was freed from the stranglehold of history.
This is a really significant turning point. It is the catalyst for the most important change in British landscape design. Stowe is the starting point of what we know today as the English Landscape School.
Stowe was created almost 300 years ago by an extraordinary man. Richard Temple had a driving ambition to climb to the pinnacle of political power and create an immortal dynasty. But less than a century after his death, his family had fallen from the heights of aristocratic pomp to become the most scandalous bankrupts in the history of England. Cobham's great dream ended in ruin, but the scale of his ambition is still written into the landscape today. Alan Power, head gardener at Stourhead and an expert on trees, is trying to get a sense of what it would have been like to approach this extraordinary garden in the 18th century.
We're right on the edge of the village of Buckingham here, but we're also right on the edge of the landscape garden at Stowe. And you can tell by the ornate nature of the gate lodges here and the enormity of that avenue that goes off into the distance, that you're also on the edge of something really, really significant.
Those privileged to visit Stowe wouldn't have walked down this avenue. They would have ridden it in carriages. Alan is using something more contemporary.
There's one sure way to make an impression, and that is to plant an avenue of trees this size, this scale, and invite you to come along it. Originally it was planted with elms to give a sense of height. The trees are marshalling your way onto the property. You know, you can't wander off piste, can you? The avenue focuses your eyes straight on the arch in the distance. You can see that the columns of the portico of the main house are beyond, so you're still not there yet. By keeping it so formal, it's really, really impressive, you know, and quite intimidating at times.
Today, the garden at Stowe is run by the National Trust, and the house where Viscount Cobham spent his childhood is now an elite public school. Cobham grew up here during a dramatic and revolutionary period in English history. Born just 24 years after the Civil War, he was just 12 at the time of the Glorious Revolution, when the Catholic King James II was overthrown and replaced by the Protestant William of Orange. His family was staunch parliamentarians who made their money in sheep farming and bought a title. By the time Richard was born, they were heavily in debt. So at just 9 years old, he was sent into the army. Strong-willed even as a child, at the age of 10, Richard was court-martialed for refusing to obey orders. Forced out of the army, he was sent to Eton and then Cambridge, but impatient to make his fortune, he abandoned his studies to rejoin the army. By the age of 20, Richard had gone abroad to Europe to fight the French. His victories on the battlefield earned him a reputation as a bold and brilliant soldier, but left him with a lifelong enmity for France. By the time he inherited Stowe, a country house and formal garden, he was financially secure and established as one of the leading military men in the country. Historian Richard Wheeler has spent his life studying Cobham and his garden.
He's hugely ambitious in every respect. He's ambitious in the army, works his way up through the ranks and ends up as a field marshal. He's ambitious socially, and he's ambitious politically, but in a very different way, because he's the theorist of the Whig Party, and he's the one who sets the tone for Whig ideology for the next 100 years. So, what he's doing here at Stowe is actually setting out a personal and political morality for young people to follow. So it's really influential stuff.
Cobham's revolution began conventionally enough with a desire to create a garden that would enhance his house, impress his peers, and raise his social status. Reflecting the fashion of the time, he began by creating a formal parterre. But over the next 50 years, a series of extraordinary circumstances would lead Cobham to ever more ambitious and radical developments that would transform his garden beyond recognition. Alan Power has come to try to get a bird's-eye view of Cobham's great creation and the huge footprint he left on the landscape, from one of the oldest residents in the garden.
Trees, they're the quietest, but probably the most important element in a landscape garden like Stowe. You can look at it in quite simple terms about how majestic trees like this cedar get. They also, in a strange kind of way, help you orientate yourself, because this cedar you can see from all over the landscape. It feels as if the tree starts welcoming you as you come up into the canopy. Before that, it just feels like an awfully long way up. What I'm seeing at the moment is a whole new Stowe landscape garden. It is like coming up and opening the stage curtains on a fantastic performance, because that's what it is. I can see the house and the axis and the view to the arch in the distance associated with the view to the Temple of the Worthies behind, and suddenly there's 2 or 3 different elements of the landscape coming together. seeing the trees in the distance, and they actually looked like shrubs. You know, so when we're gardening nowadays, we're choosing shrubs to create the same effect that they were using full-scale trees. And that really is gardening on a very, very grand scale.
Viscount Cobham, as he became known, spent a lifetime and a vast fortune creating one of the most radical and ambitious gardens in history. Cobham had a real eye for talent, and he chose the brightest and most brilliant designers and architects in the history of landscape design. From Charles Bridgman, who freed the garden from the tyranny of geometry and made the Serpentine famous, to William Kent, who leapt the fence and saw all nature as a garden, drawing inspiration from literature and the classical world to transform Stowe into an act of rebellion. And finally, a young gardener called Launcelot Brown, who earned his nickname by seeing the capability of a landscape. Brown completed Cobham's great work before transforming the English landscape with ideas pioneered at Stowe. To understand the story of Stowe is to understand how one of England's greatest creations, the landscape garden, was born.
One of the really nice things being up here is you start seeing garden designers and gardeners in the history of Stowe almost meeting each other at this point. And you've got different influences coming together. There's elements of Charles Bridgman's formality, one of the great gardeners that worked at Stowe, laid out before us. And over my other shoulder, William Kent, another great gardener from the 18th century who worked at Stowe, performing, you know, to my right-hand side. Being up here, seeing the different elements, the Kent, the Bridgman, the formal, the less formal. The distinction was being blurred, you know, between parklands and gardens. And then it was really Brown that further naturalised the landscape, kind of, they referred to it as calling in the countryside. So you welcome the countryside into the landscape garden.
But what we see today is very different from Cobham's original vision for Stowe, which was surprisingly conventional. To try and discover how this rich and multi-layered garden began, garden designer Chris Beardshaw has come to look at the original designs of Charles Bridgman.
Bridgman's plan from 1739, which is very traditional, indicates this sort of massive imposition striking through the landscape. I mean, you could be looking at Versailles here. You know, it is a highly classically inspired, great straight line axes showing dominance and control, and that's typical of the classical period. When we look at Bridgman's drawings here, it looks like a hilltop fort. It's a very prominent shape and clearly a defence. The landscape isn't sweeping in. Nature isn't allowed to sweep in. It's still kept at bay. There's very careful use of hedges and planting and parterres, and the garden exists within this rather secure space. And when we come outside of the house, well, we're straight down onto a parterre with formal watercourse, flanked by gardens on either side. We go down a double line of trees with a paved access path, and then an octagonal lake at the base. So it's very composed, very geometric, and very orchestrated.
If you came back here in 1713, you'd have seen parterre lawns. You'd have seen an avenue of poplar trees leading down to the octagonal lake. We call it the octagon. In the middle of the octagon lake, there would have been a giuglio, a fountain. So in front of you, you've got what we call a palimpsest, so layer upon layer of history evolving over time.
It's difficult to imagine just how formal and geometric gardens were at the beginning of the 18th century, but Bridgman's designs for Stowe very much reflect the sensibilities of the time. The outside world and nature itself was seen as chaotic and threatening, so gardens were enclosed, almost fortified spaces where nature was rigidly controlled by man. Historian and writer Andrea Wolfe has come to another 17th century house and garden that has survived in its original state. This is Ham House in Richmond, and its parterre garden is a vivid illustration of how the original gardens at Stowe would have looked.
What you see is a garden that is entirely ruled by straight lines. It's a rigid design, it's clipped shapes, nothing is allowed to grow out of line. Even the trees, they're pleached, so the branches grow together and they really create a green wall. And what we have to bear in mind is that this is a time when Newton, for example, has just explained nature through mathematics. So the universe is this divine clockwork, this very complex clockwork, which was designed by the divine architect. So this is about comprehending nature through reason, and this is expressed in the garden.
Though this formal style of garden had dominated England for centuries, it had come from the country of Cobham's greatest foe. In the early part of the 18th century, England was battling France's supremacy in Europe, Asia, and America.
The model of this garden really comes from France, and the supermodel of that garden is Versailles, which is the castle and the garden of the Sun King, Louis XIV, the absolute ruler. He was an arch enemy to the English, and he was Catholic.
Though Cobham had begun by following the popular fashion, he never forgot his battles against the French. Dissatisfied with his earlier plans for the garden, Cobham began to search for something different.
Gardeners like Cobham were desperately trying to find a design for an English garden that was truly English and not associated with absolutism and not associated with the Catholic Louis XIV.
To break free from French influence, Cobham decided to make his garden a crucible for new ideas. He looked for inspiration from the most brilliant Whig thinkers, writers and architects of the day. A select group of these met regularly at the Kit Kat Club, where Cobham rubbed shoulders with the playwright and architect Van Brugh, who designed many of Stowe's neoclassical buildings, and the politician and writer Joseph Addison. Addison wrote a damning critique of English gardens, arguing that the only way to break free from the influence of France was to look to the east. This oriental garden at Tatton Park in Cheshire is a late example of what emerged from increasing contact between East and West. Some of the first descriptions of Eastern gardens came from European missionaries in China, who wrote home describing gardens utterly different from anything in the West. A Jesuit priest called Jean-Denis Attiret, who served as a court painter to the Chinese emperor, wrote about his first impressions of the royal gardens. One comes out of a valley, not by a straight wide alley as in Europe, but by zigzags, by roundabout paths, each one ornamented with small pavilions and grottos. And when you exit one valley, you find yourself in another, different from the first in the form of the landscape or the style of the buildings. Sometimes a canal is wide, sometimes narrow. Here they twist, there they curve, as if they were really created by the hills and rocks. These paths also twist and turn, sometimes coming close to the canals, sometimes far away. Inspired by these revolutionary ideas from the East, Cobham took the first step to break free from centuries of formality. At Stowe, Chris Beardshaw has found the seed of what would become a radical transformation hidden among Charles Bridgman's plans.
So the most exciting element, the most exciting single ingredient in this drawing is this watercourse in here and the way that it joins the octagon at that point and this watercourse sweeping in from this side. It's this that started to get the chattering classes really excited. We start to see nature coming in. This is the hybrid, really, between high formality, classically inspired landscape and the informality of the naturalistic approach. You know, it's hard to overstate the importance of this particular view. It's, to the untrained eye, and by today's measure, it is simply a sinuous watercourse drifting off into a naturalistic landscape. But this is a really significant turning point. It is the catalyst for the most important change in British landscape design. It's about reintroducing nature into the garden. Suddenly, through a formal landscape, meanders a soft watercourse. Nature flows in and embraces the water. And what we have is a relaxation of our obsession with control of nature. It becomes a feature which every gentleman of the period had to have, the serpentine. This is the starting point of what we know today as the English landscape school.
Thanks to his work at Stowe, Charles Bridgman's profile grew, bringing him to the attention of Queen Caroline, who appointed him Royal Gardener. When she instructed him to redesign Hyde Park, Bridgman drew inspiration from Stowe to create one of the most famous man-made lakes in the world. Called the Serpentine because of its curving shape, it quickly became one of the most fashionable and imitated features in aristocratic gardens. Though Bridgman was working on a much bigger scale in Hyde Park, it all began at Stowe.
Just look at that curve. It's that sinuous nature, and it sweeps round and then flows out. It all starts here. For me, the origin of the revolution starts at the point that that water emerges.
Shortly after Richard was made a Viscount by King George, he married a wealthy young heiress. This allowed him to embark on a massive expansion plan of his gardens. In just over a decade, he extended them by 80 acres, excavating a canal, damming a river to create an 11-acre lake, and building a rotunda designed by his clubmate Van Breur that housed a gilded Venus. As his garden flourished, so did his career. In just 3 years, Cobham led a successful expedition against the Spanish, was appointed Colonel of the King's Own Horse Guard, Controller of Accounts for the Army, and a Governor of Jersey for life. Cobham's success came at a time when England was emerging as a great power. It was his direct experience of battle that inspired him to create one of the most deceptively simple but radical features in his great garden, the ha-ha.
This construction here, known as a ha-ha, is a buried boundary or fence, something that revolutionised gardens and landscape, and more specifically revolutionised the link between building and broader landscape. The notion is said to come from the French trenches that were dug in the Anglo-French wars. But in landscape terms, what ha-has were allowing a designer to do is to create division, but it's an invisible division. The boundaries become increasingly blurred, and the view from the manor house is seamless.
By opening up the garden to nature and the world outside, the ha-ha epitomised a new confidence in England and its gardens. But it was Charles Bridgman's last contribution at Stowe. His failing health forced him to retire. His successor was a flamboyant and multi-talented artist, writer and designer called William Kent. Kent had spent a decade studying art in Italy, and he drew on his experience to provide a new direction for Stowe. Looking to ancient Rome and Greece as the cradle of civilization, Kent added a new layer of sophistication to Cobham's garden by recreating the classical world.
The Palladian Bridge is an extraordinary piece of work, but probably the most incongruous in a landscape like this. A rather strange union of architecture from southern Europe, but landscape which is uniquely British. But it's a celebration of intellect. It's a celebration of wealth, of power, of education, inspired largely by the grand tour. The wealthy and the learned would go on a grand tour and see all the classical sites of Greece and Rome and the Italian Renaissance.
Cobham had won his reputation on the battlefields of Europe. Now he wanted to use his garden to lay siege to the world of the mind.
It's curious that Cobham has so many classical references and architectural features, and yet he didn't embark on a grand tour, and he wasn't that well classically educated, although a bright man. And so monuments like this almost become about convincing the wider audience that you knew what you were talking about and you were to be taken seriously.
Wealthy, well-connected, and master of one of the grandest and most admired gardens in the country, Viscount Cobham appeared to be leading a charmed life. But despite all his success and riches, he was about to undergo a moral crisis that would lead him into conflict with the most powerful man in the world, transforming his garden into a radical political protest against king and party. For most of the first half of the 18th century, English politics was dominated by one remarkable man. Sir Robert Walpole, the fifth child of a Norfolk squire, was the first man to be called Prime Minister, a title he held longer than anyone who followed him. During his 21 years in power, Walpole accumulated vast wealth, which he used to turn his family estate, Houghton Hall in Norfolk, into one of the grandest and most lavish homes in England. Brilliant, controversial, and ultimately divisive, he led his party, the Whigs, and Great Britain through a period of enormous prosperity and power. Eloquent, pragmatic, and according to some, corrupt, he was equally at home speaking in Parliament and whispering in the King's ear. Cobham's long support of Walpole's government had lifted him from the ranks, but the Prime Minister's overwhelming power and enormous wealth was causing increasing disquiet among the more idealistic Whigs. Many of them believed that Walpole's control of the King and Parliament undermined the very notion of democracy.
People don't like that he becomes, for example, the conduit for royal favours. In order to rise at court under Walpole, you have to go through Walpole. If you want to get something through Parliament, you have to go through Walpole. So he has 1 foot in St James's Palace and 1 foot in Parliament. Now that is something a lot of the people within his own party, within the Whig Party, don't particularly like, because one of the reasons for the Glorious Revolution was that there is not going to be absolute power somewhere. And suddenly there's this politician who is holding far too much power.
As Walpole's wealth and power grew even greater, accusations of corruption and intrigue grew. In 1733, Cobham decided to take a stand and risk the enmity of the most powerful man in Great Britain. At a crucial vote in the House of Commons, he withdrew his support for Walpole's government.
The opposition between Walpole and Cobham is really between the army man, the military man, and the diplomat. It's between vice versus virtue. And then they finally fall out over a very controversial tax on tobacco and wine. Cobham votes against it, and Walpole is absolutely furious. And what he does as revenge is he strips Cobham of his regiment.
Filled with fury and righteous indignation, Cobham decided to strike back at Walpole and his regime by turning his garden into a political protest. With the help of William Kent, he transformed Stowe by dividing it into 2 dramatically opposed gardens, which he called Virtue and Vice. These would highlight everything good and bad about the country he lived in. Sitting on top of the hill overlooking the Garden of Virtue is the Temple of Ancient Virtue. Sweeping down from this are the Elysian Fields, a classical paradise where the brave and virtuous went after they left this world. Flowing through this beautiful valley is the Styx, the river of the dead in Greek mythology. And on the other side of the water is the Temple of British Worthies. Highlighting both his knowledge of history and his political views, Cobham celebrated an elite group of men and women whom he regarded as the most influential and important thinkers and leaders in British history.
This is the Temple of British Worthies, and this is at the heart of Cobham's political manifesto in this garden. You have names like Sir Francis Drake, Sir Walter Raleigh, King William III, very important for Cobham because he's the man associated with the Glorious Revolution, which is for Cobham the changing moment, kind of political moment in his life. You have Queen Elizabeth, for example. She squashes Spanish ambitions. So it says, inspired by every generous sentiment, these gallant spirits founded constitutions, shunned the torrent of corruption, battled for the state, ventured their lives in the defense of their country, and gloriously bled in the cause of liberty. I like this bit, the Elysian Fields, the most in Stowe, I think, because it is such an unusual, obvious, political statement, and it's brave, and it's, you know, and it kind of shows us in a way that gardens are not just about pretty flowers. It's about much, much more, and I think that it's beautifully expressed in this garden.
Cobham wasn't just looking to English history for inspiration. On the far side of the valley, in the Temple of Ancient Virtue, he chose 4 great figures from ancient Greece as shining examples of what he believed his contemporaries should aspire to be. The poet Homer, the general Epaminondas, the lawmaker Lycurgus, and Socrates, the great philosopher.
What I find really extraordinary about this is not just the odd, pretty, lovely temple, but what Cobham is doing here is he's putting everything together into one big narrative. So as you walk through the garden, this narrative unfolds. Over there is the Temple of British Worthies. If you just look at the Temple of Ancient Virtue where we're standing and the Temple of British Worthies, they are talking to each other. So it's almost as if the moderns are looking over the river to the ancients, their ancient forefathers, and they are in conversation with each other across the garden.
These 2 temples, with their coded political message, are big enough ideas for any garden, but there's an even bigger one at the heart of William Kent's design. The gentle contours of the Elysian Fields would spark another revolution that would sweep through the English garden, transforming it beyond recognition.
When we look at this today, it doesn't look very revolutionary, I would say, but at the time when Cobham created this in the 1730s, it was absolutely different to anything that had happened before. So if you look around, this is like a natural landscape. So this is a place where he eradicated all straight lines. So you have a river here that's kind of meandering, soft, gentle lines. You have the grass sloping down. So again, this is not a kind of hard geometric parterre. You have trees that are not clipped into topiaries. He's bringing this idea of liberty into the garden. So he's removing the corset that man has imposed on nature, and he's letting the trees grow free.
In stark contrast to the lofty ideals celebrated in the Garden of Virtue, Cobham and William Kent created another garden that told a very different story. Situated at the opposite end of Stowe, the Garden of Vice is presided over by the great temptress herself, Venus, the goddess of love. Her gilded statue had been created before Kent arrived, but now he made her the central character in an erotic drama that was inspired by one of the most popular and longest poems in English, Spenser's Faerie Queen. Across the lake from the rotunda, he built a new temple to Venus, where she could seduce the unwitting visitor before they discovered her darker side. William Kent decorated the interior of this temple with colourful murals. Sadly, they haven't survived.
Coming in from the garden, which is all green and serene, and you come in here and it was a riot of colours because everything was painted here. So you had Venus presiding over the whole thing in the middle of the ceiling, and when you look outside the door you see the rotunda, which has the Medici Venus in there. So it's kind of the two Venus temples are kind of speaking to each other. And then on the walls you had murals of scenes painted after Edmund Spenser's Faerie Queen, which was a very popular book. This is all about love. It's about infidelity, it's about jealousy, it's about unrequited love. It's really the downfalls of what happens to you when you follow the pleasures of the flesh. The story it told here was about Malbecco, who was an 80-year-old man who was married to Eleanor, who was 18. So she, quite understandably I think, gets fed up with her rather senile husband after a while, and she wants to run off. And what she does is she sets fire to his treasury and then sets off with her lover.
In an age when it was becoming fashionable for gardens to tell stories, William Kent designed the Garden of Love as a stage, where the visitors weren't just in the audience, they were right in the middle of the action, walking from scene to scene.
Once Malbecco has sorted out his burned treasury, he decides that he better goes and follows his wife. So he runs into the woods and he finds Eleanor, but Eleanor who'd run off with her lover, got by her lover in the woods. She then begins to frolic with the satyrs. So Malbecco realizes that he's just lost his wife. So he goes mad. He goes mad with jealousy and he runs off. And he runs off into a cave, which is his temple of jealousy. The hermitage that William Kent built here. So the whole path from the Temple of Venus to here is almost like a stage. He kind of leads the visitor along here. You can see the rotunda with the Medici Venus kind of glinting in the distance. So wherever you go, Venus is presiding over this story. And again, it's Cobham telling us what happens to you if you follow the pleasures of the flesh.
Cobham chose the Faerie Queen because it was written as a moral fable. But the story of Malbecco and his young wife also allowed him to take another swipe at his archenemy.
At that time, Walpole has a mistress who's much, much younger. So what Cobham is doing is he's painting this portrait of Walpole as the senile, old, mad husband.
Despite Cobham's damning critique of Walpole's government, the Prime Minister remained very much in control of the country. Frustrated by his lack of progress, Cobham decided to change tack and try a more direct assault on his enemy's power base. He began by gathering the most brilliant, ambitious, disaffected young Whigs around him at Stowe. This group, made up of family members and their closest friends, became known as Cobham's Cubs. They would lead the attack on Walpole right from the garden of Stowe itself, in a specially built headquarters called the Temple of Friendship.
What he's trying to do is he's still trying to keep his hands in politics, and he's doing that by nurturing up a new generation of young politicians. So he's trying to create a new power base. You have William Pitt here, who is going to lead Britain through the 7-Year War. You have George Grenville, who will become the Prime Minister, who loses the American colony. So a lot of the future of Britain is almost born in this place. He's assembling this gaggle of bright young men who are also incredibly ambitious. So this is not just, you know, let's talk a little bit about literature and art here. This is about, like, how can we use this to, you know, to get into power and to change British politics? How can we mold and shape the future of Britain? It's quite a bold thing to do. He's creating his own, almost his own political party.
Just 5 years after the Temple of Friendship was built, Cobham and his cubs helped to force a vote of no confidence in Sir Robert Walpole, ending his 20-year domination of English politics. Cobham was now approaching 70, and though he helped to negotiate a new government, he retired from politics shortly afterwards. His political career may have ended, but his great ambitions for his garden continued. When William Kent, his head gardener, left, Cobham replaced him with a promising young 25-year-old called Launcelot Brown.
This is Capability Brown's Grecian Valley, and it really is a remarkable achievement. You look to the left and you can see some of the darker trees, you can see some of the Scots pine reaching out the top of the canopy. You look to the right and you start seeing the old characters, like that lovely sweet chestnut there. They're framing the valley, they're creating a stage for the magnificent temple in the distance, to the Temple of Concord and Victory. Capability Brown's ambition was to flood it. You know, was to fill it with water, make it his great lake at Stowe. But they couldn't quite work out how to achieve that. So I suppose, in a way, in my opinion, thankfully, we're left with this beautiful, sweeping, dog-legged valley that almost connects the garden into the landscape in the distance. And the temple on top of the hill remains the focal point. So you've been led up the valley, the Grecian Valley, to the Temple of Concord and Victory. And what you get at this point is a really precise view out through the trees to the obelisk in the distance. So precise that the trees frame it. You know, you have a really narrow frame through it. And then you sweep across the valley again, very open, and up to another very precise view to Cobham's column. And again, framed like a picture frame, created with the trees. And Cobham's overlooking this great work that he had done. It's all put together in this area wonderfully, I think. It does look quite simple. It looks quite natural, actually, which is perfect, which is what the ambition was.
After serving his apprenticeship in the most radical garden in England, Launcelot Capability Brown would use ideas pioneered at Stowe to transform the English landscape. Unlike his mentor, Viscount Cobham, Brown was not political, and neither were his gardens, which had no great message. Alan Power has come to see an example of Brown's work at Compton Verney in Warwickshire. Beautiful and deceptively simple, Brown's gift was to create a landscape that appeared natural, even though it wasn't.
These limes, they're really old characters here in the garden, aren't they? And they've just got the end of autumn hanging on the edge of their branches, and it's just like a shadow of colour on the edge of them. There's a group of trees here to bring you from the house down to this viewing point. And we can see one of Capability Brown's features emerging in the distance. We can see the bridge just beyond the tree on the edge of the lake. I think this is what Brown did really well. You know, he got you to a point, you were almost compelled to explore the garden and explore the landscape.
Brown cleverly used an architectural feature, like a bridge or a specimen tree, to create a focal point in the landscape.
That cedar's magnificent, isn't it? It's a real big, strong feature. It's compelling, it draws you towards it. It completely dominates this part of the garden and was part of Brown's intention. And here he is. This is Capability Brown at his best. So it's all there, the whole story, his bridge, his lake. His loosely planted oak trees in the foreground. This is very typical. And then beyond in the distance, you know, you've got a much heavier, dense woodland that stops your eye travelling beyond that point. And that's what Brown was genius at, controlling the views. And it's not just trees he was planting here. You know, the hills we see, the rolling hills that we see the trees planted on, they were adjusted, or improved, as they would say, in the 18th century. I love that term, you know, the improvements that were made. They were massive alterations. It's an amazing feat.
The aristocracy loved the simplicity of Brown's designs. His natural parkland was cheaper to maintain and could be used for grazing livestock, making his improvements even more appealing. His talents earned him a fortune and a host of followers who copied his ideas. By the time he died, there were 4,000 gardens in England that had been landscaped according to his principles.
It's an amazing spot, this, isn't it? We really get to reap the benefits of what landscape gardeners and landscape architects did in the 18th century. It just makes you happy that people like Brown did work like this.
In the 50 years since he began working under William Kent in Cobham's Elysian Field, the English garden had changed beyond all recognition. Viscount Cobham died at the age of 74, leaving an extraordinary mark on the landscape and history. During his lifetime, his gardens had grown from a dozen to over 200 acres. He built 36 temples, excavated 8 lakes and a dozen avenues. He built 4 miles of ha-has and commissioned almost 100 busts and statues. But his greatest legacy was to liberate the English garden from the shackles of man. Over the next 50 years, Stowe grew more and more removed from the politics that had inspired it. Cobham's family climbed further up the ranks of the nobility, becoming marquises and then dukes. But they won their titles by abandoning Cobham's political convictions. By the 19th century, the garden that had been inspired by lofty ideals had become a garden of pleasure. The first duke was notoriously self-indulgent. Unlike Cobham, he never went to war, but spent a fortune playing soldiers with his own private army. His son was even more profligate, borrowing huge sums of money to make the family estate even grander and more lavish. but the house and gardens grew more and more removed from real power. In a desperate bid to revive the family fortunes by gaining royal favour, the second Duke invited Queen Victoria to visit Stowe in 1847.
I have here an article from the Illustrated London News which describes the days of her visit here, and they're wonderful illustrations which show us what kind of show the Duke put on. He sent his yeomanry, which is basically his private army, to greet her. They were all given very elegant new uniforms. All the tenants and peasants kind of turn up, line the streets, all dressed up very nicely because the Duke had given them clothes. There were illuminations which said, "Long live the Queen, God save the Queen." So for the Duke, this is the event of his lifetime. This is the party of his lifetime. He is refurbishing the house. He buys new paintings, new silks, new curtains, new silverware, new goldware. I mean, the whole place is just so full that the Queen says that she doesn't have apartments like this in any of her palaces. When she gets let into her bedroom, she sees this huge Persian carpet and she says to her husband, "Oh, Albert, I know this carpet. It was offered to me, but I didn't want to spend so much money on a carpet."
The Duke borrowed hundreds of thousands of pounds to put on this lavish entertainment, and by the time the royal visit was over, he owed £1.5 million, around £1 billion in today's money. His extravagant display of wealth hadn't impressed Victoria and Albert, who epitomised a new age of self-restraint. Smelling blood, his creditors closed in. The Duke was left with no choice but to open his doors and put the contents of his great home up for sale. Christie's were the auctioneers, and this contemporary sale is filled with the kind of lavish furnishings that would have been on sale at Stowe.
In the summer of 1848, this house, these rooms were filled with strangers who came to buy all the possessions of the Duke of Buckingham. And they could buy this book, which is the sales catalogue, and everybody who could afford this for 15 shillings could bring in 4 people. So it was like the entrance ticket. Everything was sold, from the wine to the bed linen. Furniture, paintings, candlesticks, silverware. Those 40 days in the summer of 1848, that is really the end of Stowe as we know it.
024, 95, 807, £12,000 all finished at 12.
A lot of people from within the kind of aristocracy just thought that the Duke had really brought shame to their class because he was so extravagant and so over the top. There's a wonderful article in the Times, written at that time, which says, "A man of the highest rank and of a property not unequal to his title has flung all away by extravagance and folly and reduced his honours to the tinsel of a pauper and the baubles of a fool." It's the end of Cobham's dream. That's really what it is. The dream of creating this dynasty, the dream of shaping Britain's future, all of that is at an end that summer.
Cobham's family never recovered from the financial devastation caused by the second Duke. In 1910, they sold the house and gardens, and it was turned into a public school.
Right, okay guys, so here we are. This is the entrance to the Elysian Fields.
Cobham's cubs are long gone, but new generations have been shaped by the garden.
We're going to stop off at the Temple of Ancient Virtue. So have a quick look, turn around. I don't think it's possible to grow up in a place like Stowe and not be affected by the place itself. There is a message that infuses the garden, that ideas matter, that people of the past have something to say to people in the present. There are not many places that are as evocative as that.
To promote his political ideas, Cobham encouraged visitors to Stowe, beginning a fashion for garden tourism that would sweep through the country. Over the last 20 years, the National Trust has spent £6.5 million restoring his gardens to their pomp and glory. Stowe's influence is far-reaching. Cobham's Garden of Ideas didn't just overthrow a prime minister. Its serpentine lakes and rolling fields sparked a revolution which freed the English garden from centuries of Western formality to become something unique and quintessentially British.
You really get a sense of how the landscape has been moulded and formed and how the tree plantation works. I mean, this is essentially the English landscape that we're looking at, and it's a very manufactured product. And really, that's the legacy of Stowe. It's set up in us the idea that our landscape should appear like this, and you can see why, as a nation of gardeners, we have separated ourselves from the rest of the Western world, and that chasm starts to emerge right here. It's this landscape that creates that sense of division. It drives a wedge between the Western landscape principles and the English landscape principles. And we carry that with us 300 years later.
Next time we go on a journey around the globe in a revolutionary Victorian garden, Biddulph Grange. It's a story of empire, science and religion.
This garden is like a very bizarre piece of Victorian theatre. For me, it feels almost as if I've stepped into Alice in Wonderland.
Wow, look at that!